Hello, and welcome back. The hand of the night is drifting forward yet again, which means it's time for us to finish this discussion. This video will be working off what we discussed previously, connecting some of my favorite candidates to theories in the first video. Before we begin, I also want to point out that despite the fact that this interpretation has fallen out of favor in the community, I still think there's a pretty good chance for Chris to be the knight. Not to bury the lead here, but of all the potential candidates, Chris fits into Deltarune's themes better than any other, which would only make sense considering the fact that Chris is the main character. Either way, we won't be talking about that today. There are 4 main candidates I want to touch on, and 2 honorable mentions, let's call them. Before we get into that though, I need to do a little bit of housekeeping. I actually made a pretty big mistake in the previous video. Over the course of making that video, I changed my mind on the first theory, and I completely forgot to update it. The entire time I've been working on this video, I've had that updated version on my mind, and as a result, I don't think it's going to make a lot of sense unless I explain it here. So here are the corrections. At the part where I explain in more detail, I should have said, basically the reason I think the knight is so focused on causing the roaring is because they believe it's the only way to ensure the heroes will win. In the grand scheme of things, it's not that big of a change, and honestly I should have kept it more general to begin with, but ultimately I think it makes more sense this way. I really do like the original idea, but there's also a pretty big flaw in it. Whoever the knight is, they are almost certainly living in Hometown right now, and if we assume that Chris is the only human in Deltarune, they would 100% know that Chris is one of the heroes. Regardless of if Chris actually is the only human or not, I think that you'll see that with the candidate I've selected, this updated version works much better. I'm sorry for this mistake, and I hope it doesn't impact your enjoyment of the video. Anyway, let's actually get started. Asgore. I believe that Asgore fits well into the first theory we touched on in my previous video. Not many people think or want Asgore to be the knight, and I understand that. He was one of the primary antagonists in Undertale, and it would be strange to do that again. However, we have seen that some of Undertale's events are playing out in a distorted way in the world of Deltarune. With that in mind, I don't think it's impossible for Asgore to be an antagonist yet again. In my previous video, I mentioned that a good candidate, aside from some special circumstances we'll discuss later, needs to be willing, able, and have connections to the game's main themes, and I believe that Asgore fits all these things very well. Asgore as a character in Undertale has a deep and genuine care for the monsters around him. Despite that, he is also a coward, who is too afraid to either let go of the past and make amends with the humans, or leave the underground and fulfill his promise to monster kind. Asgore has a strong duality in his character, and this internal struggle is hardly touched on in-game. Making this duality a key part of his character development in Deltarune could help to retroactively deepen our understanding of Asgore in Undertale. I also think that this aspect of his character fits well into the knight role. The balance between light and dark, and the duality between them, is exactly what the legend is describing. It would only make sense for a character with his own internal conflict to represent this clash. Bringing these aspects to the forefront, and having the conflict shape around the world of Deltarune, I think is different enough to keep Asgore fresh and interesting. Asgore's backstory in Deltarune is actually pretty similar to the secret bosses. All are people who once held high positions within society that now find themselves forgotten. I find this very interesting. This could show that a bit of his personality and personal feelings are bleeding into these dark worlds that he's creating. I also think it works well thematically for a once well-respected, now discarded town official to be the one responsible for creating these worlds where discardment is on the mind of so many inhabitants. And Asgore is one of the only characters that shares this theme in such a significant way. Our encounter with the knight is bound to be a big moment of revelation, and I think that having Asgore at its center would make a lot of sense. In my mind, it seems highly likely that his backstory is tied into whatever happened to Des. The Holidays and Dreamers clearly had a storied history since long before the events of Deltarune, and lifelong relationships like that don't just fall apart out of nowhere. I think it would make a lot of sense to get more information about whatever this event was alongside Asgore's reveal as the knight. I also believe that whatever this event was, it ties into the angel in some way. There's already been a couple of allusions to angels in relation to Noel, and I don't think that Asgore being connected to that event is a coincidence. The implications that this would have for Chris and our relationship with them are intriguing to me, potentially driving a wedge between us and Chris even more. This also creates another avenue for a more thorough exploration of Chris's character, which I think many people would agree is one of the things they're looking forward to seeing. I'm a big fan of the idea that after watching his life fall apart and believing the angel is responsible, Asgore finds out about the legend, and, under the belief that this is the only way to defeat the angel, sets the events of the game into motion, leaving it ambiguous as to whether fate had anything to do with this at all. Asgore is one of the few characters that fits nicely into a large amount of Deltarune's established themes without having to do too much legwork to justify his place in the story, and I think that Asgore's character just lends well to this interpretation of the knight. Asgore would most likely know that Chris is one of the heroes, and as we know, Asgore is kind of notorious for hoisting responsibility onto the young. I believe that Asgore represents these themes well enough to be in contention for the knight. This next candidate can be kind of contentious. Father Alvin. I have seen general consensus shift back and forth on this character a few times now. Many believe that he is one of the most logical fits for the knight, and many others believe that he is a completely irrelevant side character. Regardless, I believe that Father Alvin has a lot going for him and is worth a closer look. Father Alvin, despite not having a character portrait, seems to be an important figure in Hometown. He has a small connection to the room where the first Dark World was created. He'd be one of the most knowledgeable people when it comes to the Angel, and is the most likely of all the Hometown residents to know about the legend and the Roaring. He also, believe it or not, has a strong thematic connection to the Dark World. From what we know about Xeno and Deltarune, he was an author, the one responsible for the famous book series Lord of the Hammer. One of the main takeaways from our brief conversation with Alvin is that he seemingly has a desire to follow in his father's footsteps. I feel like it would be perfect for the son of an author to be trying in some strange way to continue that work by creating these dark worlds. Alvin also has the benefit of being closely connected to religious themes as well. Alvin is the pastor of the church in Hometown, and with the allusions to the angel, the center of Hometown's religion, being an important figure to the plot, it could stand to reason that the one who would know the most about the angel would be involved. We also know from the legend itself that the Dark World and Angel's Heaven are directly connected. But let's direct our focus back to Alvin. We don't know nearly as much about Alvin as we do Asgore, but Alvin also seems to have a bit of duality going on. If I were to take a stab in the dark, this conflict could be a sort of identity crisis, debating whether he should stay working as a pastor, or if he should try to mold himself to live up to his father's legacy. And it would appear that Alvin has already found a partial solution to his problem. As the knight, Alvin would not only be creating these fictional worlds, but also be working towards the Angel's Heaven. This could be pointing to a potential negative character arc, where he gets more and more desperate to escape from his father's shadow. This kind of arc is one we haven't really gotten to see firsthand in Toby's writing, and if Deltarune is going to have more of a focus on character growth, I think it would be cool to see a character go down this path. But that's just one very big assumption. Even without that, though, I think that his connections to the Angel and the religious themes of Deltarune make him fit quite nicely. I wouldn't be surprised that even if Alvin isn't the knight, that he will have his part to play in the narrative. Even just having him show up in a Dark World at some point could give us a lot of interesting insight into the Angel, Hometown's religion, and to his character. Putting all of these connections together, I feel like we just can't write this character off. This next one is pretty interesting. Papyrus. Papyrus fits best with a third theory we discussed in my first video. He works much better as someone who is unaware of the danger the Dark World poses. The skeleton we know from Undertale wouldn't really want to put people in danger, but at the same time, he's the exact kind of person that would be drawn in by the Dark World. And so, as we discussed previously, I believe that the best way to facilitate this is for Papyrus to be getting manipulated. And ironically, we actually have a precedent for this kind of thing happening to Papyrus. In the true pacifist route of Undertale, Flowey manipulates Papyrus into gathering the main cast of characters to the barrier. It's also told to us that Papyrus has spoken to Flowey many times. Sans is the only character to address this in-game, and it's kind of a weird subplot that doesn't get talked about a lot. You could just write it off as the story needing a way to gather the main cast at the end of Pacifist, however, I think there was more to it than that. And that's not to imply that I think it was specifically setting up for Deltarune, just that I think there was a little more intention behind picking Papyrus in particular. This establishes that Papyrus is not only gullible, but also willing to overlook a lot just to gain a friend. And when you really think about it, Papyrus is the only character that would actually be willing to truly befriend Flowey, aside from Frisk, of course. I think it's very possible that Papyrus is in a similar situation in Deltarune, a naive and well-meaning monster that is being manipulated by someone much more cunning. Like I mentioned in the previous video, this opens up the possibility of a Darkner being the true antagonist, which could make a lot of sense. As we just established, Papyrus is pretty gullible, and would likely be easily tricked or convinced to open dark fountains for a Darkner. He was also pretty desperate for, and struggled to, make friends in the world of Undertale. We don't know how similar his Deltarune counterpart is just yet, but I think it's safe to assume he's pretty much the same. Papyrus has always had a certain level of innocence, and a character arc where he actually confronts this part of himself, and grows from it, would be a nice way to make him stand out from his appearance in Undertale. In that game, he never truly confronts that part of his character, and we never see his character grow. That's not to his detriment, mind you. I think many would agree that Papyrus is one of their favorite characters, myself included. However, I think that Deltarune will put more of a focus on growing up and character growth. And because of this more innocent nature, I think he fits right in with the Dark World's themes of fiction versus reality. The Dark World is, in essence, a fictional story so immersive that it can manifest real consequences. But despite that, it is still fictional. And, at the end of the day, whatever friends you gain or experiences you have, they're essentially fake. Papyrus may have a hard time coming to terms with this fact. Pair that with the realization that he was being used, and I think you get a pretty compelling story. I think that Papyrus is one of the only characters that fits nicely into this take on the Knight. It's not very hard to imagine him entering the Dark World, meeting a Darkner, and being manipulated into this position by being promised an important role. One where he would receive respect and many friends. And while of course Papyrus and his story are important, this theory is kind of a package deal. It's probably pretty obvious where I'm going with this now. Ralsei is in a lot of ways a surrogate Flowey. He offers his interpretation of the world as the correct way, gives us the battle tutorial, and says almost the exact line verbatim that Flowey does. Not to mention his yet unexplained relation to Asriel. Ralsei is the most friendly and approachable Darkner there is, and would likely have a very easy time befriending and manipulating Papyrus. If the story follows this course of events, then I think it's highly likely the legend is in actuality a fabrication. And I believe I have a very compelling reason for this to be the case. His plan seems to rely on Chris, Susie, and possibly even us, believing not only in this legend, but that we are the heroes of it. This story of light and dark is an excellent way to bolster his supposed importance, and to convince others to listen to him. A story of hopes and dreams, one where we can all have an impact, is an alluring proposition. And of course, every good story needs an antagonist. What better way to make a fun and compelling story for us all to be heroes in than to have control over its antagonist? Ensuring that there is always a happy ending. That everyone is having a good time, that the dream doesn't have to end. With the Knight at his command, Ralsei doesn't need to play the bad guy. Much like Papyrus, Ralsei has a desire for friendship. Putting himself in the role of an indispensable guide has finally given him the chance to fulfill that dream. Living out his own fantasy, one where everyone is happy. All it takes is sacrificing the dreams of one Lightner. Fabricating all of this just so that he could have some friends.
It's a total fabrication.
While I do think this idea works really well with the themes I established with Papyrus, I am fully willing to acknowledge other interesting possibilities. Much like we've discussed with the Knight themselves, Ralsei could have a variety of motives, ranging anywhere from completely benign to totally malicious. Despite the fact that Ralsei and Papyrus' stories would be interconnected, they don't necessarily need to share a theme. With Ralsei being reintroduced to the narrative as an antagonist, he could bring with him different themes, radically altering the tone and direction of the plot. Personally, I'm a big fan of Ralsei having a heel turn moment where he goes full villain, but with what we know right now, I think what I just laid out makes the most sense, narratively speaking. I feel like at this point it's almost universally agreed that something is off about Ralsei. The eternal debate on whether he is an antagonist or just a little guy is as strong as ever. Manipulating everyone, though, is objectively wrong, no matter if his intentions are wholesome or not. I think adding an element like this would give his character some much needed depth, and make for a really cool twist. Ralsei is a character that's being propped up by the mysteries that surround him. And the second these mysteries are revealed, I think he will become a considerably more interesting and engaging character. Before we leave this thought, however, there is a more sinister interpretation of this idea. In the previous video, I also speculated the knight is being literally controlled like a puppet. Now, while using the same framework we just laid out, and using a new theme to work with, we can have a look at a more malicious take on Ralsei's story. For some reason, he is keeping close tabs on our actions, keeping his true intentions hidden, all the while opening fountains himself with his puppet. His ultimate goal for all of this is a little hard to guess at. Many people point to Castletown becoming populated as a possible goal, but while Ralsei does ask us to treat everyone kindly, he hardly objects to our refusal to do so. One thing to note is that at the start of Chapter 2, everyone's stats increase. I think it's a logical assumption that this trend will continue, but that seems rather trivial to be his master plan. So this leaves us with some secret third thing. Traveling with us is giving him some kind of unseen benefit. Whatever that may be, it's pretty hard to say. Maybe he's searching for some kind of item in the Dark Worlds, or maybe he's gaining something more esoteric. Whatever it is, it's valuable enough that he will remain with us, despite us not listening to him. And there's actually another interesting connection back to Flowey. Part of Flowey's character in Undertale is meant to be a reflection of the player, and so it stands to reason that Deltarune's Flowey would play a similar role. We the players are controlling Chris, and it's heavily implied that we are not only doing things against their will, but also things that are making them actively uncomfortable. This puts the narrative in an interesting position. Any attempt to condemn Ralsei for his actions would also apply to us in a way. I know a lot of people really dislike the idea of the game saying we should feel bad simply for playing it, and so do I. After all, we didn't have any say in controlling Chris in the first place. However, I believe this could be an excellent way for the story to directly address our connection to Chris, and give us more context on what exactly is going on. If it's handled with care, I believe it could also do so without veering too far in the player-guilty direction. But let's get back on topic. This is a video about the knight, after all. Interestingly enough, I feel like you could kind of get away with putting any character here. Ralsei and Chris would be our primary focus. The knight could just be an unfortunate victim. But I do think there is one character that stands above the rest, and that character is the vessel. It's unknown what happened to her creation after the opening sequence of the game, and many are speculating that this character could make a return appearance. It ending up as the knight would make for some great irony, and really hammer home any fears Chris might have about being under our control. I think that using the vessel here would allow for the story to really focus in on Chris. The vessel is basically a non-character anyway, so there's really not much to explore with it. But what it represents for Chris and their internal conflict is definitely worth exploring. One of Undertale's biggest draws for me is how it deconstructs the RPG genre. With Deltarune seemingly shifting focus to deconstructing the way we connect with games in a broader sense, putting a spotlight on the relationship between us the player and our player character, our literal connection point into the world of Deltarune, would be really compelling. And no matter which of these theories is your personal favorite, I think that that particular idea is going to be a part of Deltarune's meta-narrative regardless. Before we wrap up, I said at the start there are two other candidates to mention. These of course are the two we can never fully rule out. Both Sans and Gaster have a decent possibility of being the knight. Both characters are steeped in so many layers of mystery, an equivalent dosage of caffeine would be lethal. I personally would still argue against these characters being the knight. However, despite my objections, I will admit that these characters do have potential in the role. Darkness, being such an omnipresent theme in Deltarune, could point to Gaster being a more apparent antagonist. However, with this much build-up, I feel like being the surface-level antagonist of Deltarune is a little bit below Gaster. I feel like his role would be more significant and likely more subtle than just the man behind the mask. Sans, on the other hand, I could see much more. The fact that he was one of the main cast in Undertale and we still know so little about him could point to us learning more about him in Deltarune. If this is in fact the same Sans throughout both games, him being the knight would be a great way to explain his disposition in Undertale. It can also square away a lot of loose ends related to him, potentially explaining his unique ability to, The don't forget photo in his lab does imply a connection to Deltarune, but it's this photo that makes me think Sans will not be the knight. The implication to me has always been that this was a cherished item that represented a happy memory, one that Sans would not want to forget. Whatever the truth behind this image is, I feel as though it points to Sans being an ally to us, not a villain. Regardless, both of these characters are far more interesting on their own, and don't really need to be the knight to justify their role or presence in the story. And again, I'm not saying they would actively be bad in the role, just that they would be more interesting outside of it. This goes without saying, but all of this is completely wild speculation. There is little to no hard evidence to suggest that any of these theories are actually true. I think any of these options would work well, but that's only my opinion. Ultimately, we lack the context needed to fully assess what will take place in the story, and what themes will work best for the outcome Toby Fox is building towards. Despite that though, I really hope you all enjoyed. With chapters 3 and 4 right on the horizon, I'm looking forward to making new theories with the explosion of new information we're about to get. Needless to say, I'm gonna be there day one, just like everyone else. I had plans on one more Deltarune video before the next chapters, but with my current speed, that's looking pretty unlikely. I have plans to do videos on Everhood, Hylics, and the Souls series at some point, so be on the lookout for that. Or who knows, maybe I'll just lock in and finish that Deltarune video. Regardless, whatever comes next will be an analysis of some kind. If you have any problems with the candidates I presented, have something I missed, or want to share your own favorites, let me know in the comments. Again, I absolutely love unhinged, borderline conspiratorial takes, so do not hold back. I've been considering doing some kind of stream, whether that be a comment response a la Andrew Cunningham or a pre-chapters prediction thing. I don't know. Let me know if any of that interests you. Anyway, with all that being said, thank you all so much, and good night.